In this auditing of step 2, you need to calculate straight and overtime pay. So let's jump into that and show you what that looks like. So it's important to understand that we're going to go through two types of calculations today. We're going to go through hourly non-exempt and tipped employee calculations. So hourly non-exempt calculations are pretty simple. Now, you're going to follow this same path with me, and you're going to notice that this is pretty similar. And anytime somebody asks me about, is this person paid correctly, I always go off of this particular formula or repetition of steps, where I find the total pay, I find the regular rate of pay, the overtime premium rate, the overtime premium, and the total gross pay. So the total pay is really simple. You take the total number of hours for the work week that the person worked times their hourly rate of pay. The regular rate of pay, on the other hand, is where you take that total pay and divide it by the total hours. In most cases, it's going to be exactly the same rate that you just had in the beginning. It's not going to be any different. The overtime premium rate is where you're taking the regular rate of pay and you're multiplying it times a half. The reason why is because you've already paid all straight time hours, which includes, if you multiplied it by 43 hours, you've already paid the one portion. To pay the half portion, you need to just pay the half portion for those overtime hours. And that's all you're doing in this case. That's where the half overtime premium rate and overtime premium comes into play. And now the total gross pay is where you're taking the total pay plus the overtime premium. So now that we've looked at this pattern, let's go ahead and jump into a real world example. So John is paid $8.25 an hour and worked 43 hours. Well, again, first thing we have to do is find the total wages. So we're going to take $8.25 an hour times the 43 hours to give us this total amount of wages. The next step in this process is to find the regular rate of pay. So we're going to take that full total wage and divide by 43 hours, and guess what we get? We get the same rate that we had up above. That shouldn't be any different, and it should be the correct one. Keep in mind, if this person is not paid minimum wage, at or above minimum wage, that's something you need to consider and something you will need to fix and make sure the person is paid at least minimum wage. But neither here nor there, because that's the case. This person's paid in a state maybe that's $7.25 an hour and he's paid $8.25 an hour, so he's good. So what we do at this point is we take the overtime premium rate of $8.25 an hour and we multiply it times a half to get this half portion. Now we take the overtime premium and we take this rate that we just found, the overtime premium rate, times the number of overtime hours to give us this amount. And then the total gross wages is where we take the total gross wages up above, which are the total wages earned, plus the overtime premium to give us this amount right here. So that's how you calculate total wages, regular rate of pay, overtime premium rate, overtime premium, and total gross wages for an hourly non-exempt employee. Now, the tipped hourly non-exempt calculation is a little bit more involved. While I'm going off of this course for the federal minimum wage and the federal cash wage and federal tip credit, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to follow the same stipulations. You might be in a state that doesn't have a tip credit. You might be in a state that pays a much higher cash wage. Those things have to be accounted for. But in all fairness, it should be fairly simplistic. The total cash pay is the first thing you need to find, where you take the cash wages, which in my case are $2.13 an hour because I'm going off of federal, times the hours that they worked. Then you need to find total tips. This is where you take the credit card and the cash tips and you add them together. Now, as we did with the non-exempt employee a moment ago, we found the total pay, which is where we add all the wages together. So in this case, we take the total cash pay plus the total tips. Now, after we find total pay, we then need to find the regular rate of pay, which is where we take the total pay and divide it by the total number of hours. It's important to note that if for any reason the regular rate of pay is not equal to or greater than the minimum wage of federal or the minimum wage of the state that you're in, you must pay what's called a tip shortfall, or I sometimes refer to it as the tip shortfall credit, where you're making up for the wages because the person is not at the level they're supposed to be at. We will talk about that in just a bit. Once you find the regular rate of pay, then you'll take the overtime premium rate, which is where you take that state, or in this case, the federal minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, which is what I'm using, times a half. Once I find the overtime premium rate, I multiply that times the overtime hours. And then the total gross wages, this is where I add in the total pay, which again is going to be total cash pay plus total tips, plus the overtime premium above, and that gives us the total gross wages. Now, just to be clear here, the Fair Labor Standards Act is very clear in what you must use to calculate overtime. They said overtime must be calculated based on the full minimum wage. So if it's going off the federal, it's $7.25 an hour. If you're in a state that pays $11 an hour, you must look at that rate when you're trying to figure out what the overtime premium rate is. Okay, so in this example, Jackson is paid $213 an hour cash wages, and he receives $150 in total tips and worked 43 hours. So taking this information, we're going to now figure out what the total cash wages are, where we take $213 an hour times the number of hours to give us the total cash wages. Then the total wages is where we add in the $91.59 above, and we add in the tips, and this gives us our total wages. So once we get total wages, we need to figure out what the regular rate of pay is. That's the most important piece. It'll answer the question, are we paying at least minimum wage or above? So we take those total wages and divide it by the number of hours. And look what it gives us. It gives us a rate of $5.61.08. So what that means is it's paying less than $7.25 an hour. So this is where we pull out the tip shortfall credit. So in this case, what is the tip shortfall and what do we need to pay this person? Well, it's pretty simple. You need to pay at least $7.25 an hour if it's in the federal. So I'm going to take that times 43 hours to give me this total number. So since I was only paying $241.59 with the total cash wages and total tips, I need to pay him additional to get him up to $311.75, and that would be a total of $70.16. That's something I would have to do. Now, the overtime premium rate, remember, it's looking at minimum wage. So since I'm going off of federal, that's $7.25 an hour times a half. So that's $3.625. Now, the overtime premium is where we take that amount we just found times the number of overtime hours to give us this amount over here. Now, the total gross wages, I didn't break it up, so forgive me, but this $311.75 would be no different if I said $241.59 plus $70.16 plus $10.88. It would be no different. So I'm just adding in the total straight time wages plus the total overtime to give me this amount right here. Now, in this case, Jackson is actually paid the same amount. However, he receives $325 in total tips and he worked 43 hours. So what happens in this case? Well, as you can see, total cash wages, $213 an hour times 43 hours gives us the same amount we had before. But then the total wages, where we add in the tips, he gets $416.59. Now remember, after we find the total wages, we got to go to find the regular rate of pay to see if this person is paid at least minimum wage or higher. So we take those total wages, divide it by the number of hours, and guess what? State or federal minimum wage in this case is $7.25 an hour. So he's paid $9.69 an hour. So that tells me he is above minimum wage. So he is actually in the clear. Now the overtime rate, we're going off of minimum wage, which in this case is $7.25 an hour times a half. Then we take that half portion and multiply it by the hours of overtime. And then we simply take the $416.59, which is above, plus the $10.88 in overtime, and this is how much he is owed in wages.